Hi, everybody. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Jairus.
Hi, Jairus.
Hi, everybody on the panel.
Hi, Jairus.
Hi, Jairus. I'm Jairus Khan. I am ostensibly your moderator for the evening. Thank you for coming to Too Sexy for Tumblr. I work for the Mozilla Foundation, which is like the place where we make Firefox. I work for the nonprofit end. I'm an activist, organizer, hacker, troublemaker, rabble-rouser, renegade, drifter. No, I'm none of those things. But it should be a good panel. If you have questions, feel free to ask them during the panel. But wait for the orange mic to come around. That way it'll be recorded and everyone can hear it. I will let my co-panelists introduce themselves.
Are we starting all the way at this
Starting
end?
with Maximum Lander.
I once had an Uber driver so convinced that my first name was Maximum that they started insisting that I call them Minimum and that we become pals. It was a weird moment. My name is Max Lander. I'm an artist and I guess sometimes technologist. I have been a photographer for a million years. I make films. Many of them contain a whole lot of smut. And I also make weird, sexy VR that has to do with strange bodily entanglements.
Award-winning smut.
Award-winning smut, it's true.
Yeah.
We have a fabulous feminist porn community in Canada, in Toronto, and we give out wonderful things called the Feminist Porn Awards every year.
Hi there. I'm Natalie Zina Walschots. Zina is my actual real-ass middle name. I'm very proud of it. Thank you. I'm a writer and community manager and a general person on the internet. And a lot of my writing is extremely weird and involves a lot of body horror and a lot of very, very terrible things happening. Sometimes I make weird stuff with Max as well. When we make conceptualize horror games, the goal is always for me to try and write something so Max would have to build a game that he himself could not play. That is too horrible. So that's So I come from to this panel from the perspective of somebody who makes terrible things and would like them to be available on the internet.
I'm Jim Nettles. I'm a business and technology consultant. I am a science fiction and fantasy author. I work and write a lot of stuff in nonfiction about internet, AI, BI, various technology stuff. I do some bleeding edge work. I work in some areas of entertainment, some VR work, and just sort of in general, if there's somewhere I can go cause trouble, I am in the game. Thus, I have scotch waiting for me when I get here. Thanks, Rodney.
Hello. Thanks for coming out, everybody. My name is Kurt Opsahl. I am the Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to defending your rights online, and we care a lot about, amongst other things, freedom of expression. And so we're very concerned when the companies will take down things that would otherwise be protected by free expression. And so this is, bringing us to the issues of content moderation and the topic we're coming tonight, when it's machines that are making the decisions, often taking down content that has value to be out there in their attempt to make sure that their platforms are clean in some manner. So I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Hi everyone, my name is Erica Portnoy. I'm a technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I do some coding work, I do some policy work, and taking off my AFF hat, have also done a bit of fandom, academic literature studies as well.
Okay, so let's go back in time. This year is 2013. Tumblr is great. Tumblr was awesome. It gets bought by Yahoo.
Great and terrible.
Great and terrible. I mean, yes, great and terrible. Yeah, past tense. It gets bought by Yahoo for $1.1 billion. Summing up the sentiment of the time, CEO of Yahoo, Marissa Mayer, actually says, and I quote, "We promise not to screw it up." The year is 2016. Yahoo writes down $712 million of Tumblr's value. They may have screwed it up. 2017, Verizon, noted pornographers, acquire Yahoo, thus acquiring Tumblr. Tumblr used to be on the front lines of the fight for net neutrality. Verizon, less so. Tumblr's activism kind of quiets down a bit. 2018, in November, Tumblr vanishes from the Apple App Store. It turns out what happened is that someone went on Tumblr and came across what appeared to be child pornography. Now, Tumblr, like most platforms, collaborates with other platforms and has access to a database of hashes of common images of terrorism and exploitation so they can catch it before it goes online. But not every image is in there. So an image goes up, someone sees it in the app, they report it to the Apple App Store instead of Tumblr. Apple is like, well, that's terrible, and they take the app offline. So the Tumblr app vanishes. A couple days later, Tumblr comes back online, and they announce that they will be banning adult content in image, video form. They deploy a new AI, machine learning, to classify images as adult or not. It is terrible. It's comically bad. It classifies things like packages of chicken as porn. Some people take porn and it's like, oh, it's porn, and then they put a picture of like an owl in the corner, and now it's like, oh, it's not porn anymore. It's not good. So the hashtag too sexy for Tumblr comes out because basically anything is too sexy for Tumblr. The ban takes place in late December. And this is important, not just because, porn and it's funny because bad AI, but Tumblr, in addition to being a community that was good at fandom and good at a lot of other things, was home to a lot of communities that couldn't find a home anywhere else. LGBTQ communities that couldn't find a home anywhere else. A lot of sex workers were on Tumblr, feminist or pornographers of color, fan artists, /artists, and these communities had been thriving for a really, really long time. And when Tumblr said, "Okay, we're killing everything," there isn't really a place for them to go that's easy and ready-made that will accept adult content. So there's a lot of communities where people had known each other for a really, really long time. People made friends. People grew up on Tumblr, and you end up in this situation where, because of, on some level, centralization, because it gets bought by Yahoo gets bought by Verizon, they have to go through the Apple App Store, Apple pulls it, you have all of these communities kind of cut off at the knees, right? The kind of diaspora. So it's a big problem. My first question to my fellow panelists is, do you think, and if so, what responsibility, do you think platforms have a responsibility to their communities in a sense like this? And if so, what are they supposed to do when they come across these kinds of problems with problematic adult content, or trying to figure out how to moderate huge amounts of content coming in?
All right, I'll bite. Yes, I think that they should have a responsibility to protecting their users and the communities that have been built there. And this can be involved in a lot of ways. I mean, one is whether your standards, the content that you allow on the site, is in keeping with what the community wants to have on there. And it seems that this change was not, right. It was taking away aspects of the community who were engaged in free expression, to which they had every right to be engaged in, and using the platform, enjoying using the platform for that. And they didn't have as part of a discussion. There was no feedback from the community. It was just putting a ban there. But the other way in which they really did, I think, a disservice to the communities and to the users of Tumblr was to be really bad at it and have no good appeals mechanism. That they were. first of all, how bad they were. I mean, you probably saw some of these things, but it was ludicrously bad. Like things that like boxes and Louis Vuitton bags and black and white drawings that had nothing to do with sex were being determined to be too sexy. But like one thing that's very important for all the companies actually engaged in content moderation is to provide like an appeals process, an effective appeals process where you can get to a human. So even if the machine has made a mistake, that a human can override that machine, provide transparency about what takedowns you're doing, how many takedowns you're having. A lot of these sort of principles, so EFF and a number of other organizations were involved in something called the Santa Clara Principles, where there was a conference on content moderation in Santa Clara, California, and these came out with these principles about transparency, about appeals, to say that like even if you put aside what the standard is, and I think we can also should discuss that in this case, but if you put that aside, in order to respect your communities, you have to provide them with this level of transparency and a chance to fix the problem, to tell someone that this is wrong, and get the content reevaluated. Though I would also say that one of the things that is very key here was the App Store, the role of the App Store in this, and that Tumblr I think was making a business decision where they felt that the prospect of this happening again, being 2 days not available in the App Store was too dangerous. And so this is also why Apple needs to have good processes and try to make sure that they are not taking down especially lawful content just because. And it's kind of funny because like on the Apple device, if you use a browser like their built-in Safari browser, you can get to all of this stuff. But if it is a app that is a platform that allows to get to it, like they're treating it differently. And then as far as a business decision goes, well, it wasn't a very wise business decision in the end. It didn't work out well for Tumblr, eventually getting sold for, the rumor has it, $3 million.
So one of the things that happened after the December big hit, and they basically deplatformed so much of the stuff around quote-unquote adult content, or quote-unquote what they were classifying as now offensive content, LGBTQ, so many of the communities that had built Tumblr, a number of people pinged me and said, hey, what's your opinion on this? And it started out as just a couple of quick articles, and I wrote a couple of longer pieces and longer articles. And I detailed out, here's one of the core problems we have right now with the internet and with the platforms that are on it. The internet is moving from being a 2-year-old toddler stumbling around to being, a mid-level preteen whose parents are throwing a party in the backyard but don't want the kids to see what's going on. And we have the politics and the business and how readily things can quickly change based on who owns it. A company and a provider can take any platform and do anything they want to on a given basis. When I'm talking to clients, when we're talking about brand building, marketing, all the rest of these pieces, the first thing we encourage people to do is to make sure you have a presence and ability to connect with your base somewhere that they don't own. These are great communities and great tools to form communities and bonds, but we too readily see these platforms decide to make a change in a business model, and sometimes it's not even a change within their policies, but even depending on who their moderators are offshore, what their own personal beliefs are, we see things that are flagged and taken down that don't even necessarily violate those principles. So there's way too much between the AIs and even the individual humans that look and moderate with content that flows through the platform. So what I wrote and said was, as much as it sucks and as much of a bad business decision as it may be, we see companies are always going to go to the lowest common denominator and the thing that's least likely to make them sued, even if it puts them out of business.
Couple things. To answer your question directly, do platforms have responsibilities to their users? Absolutely. The relationship between users and platforms is completely symbiotic, and I think as we've seen with the complete disillusion of Tumblr, that it's worth so little because there are no users. So that's like the platforms have to understand that their identities are completely bound up with the people who make them up. Thing the first. Thing the second. So electronic moderation, AI moderation, in my opinion, almost always fails. Sometimes it's hysterically bad. Sometimes it's like, not the worst, but still pretty bad. But there's absolutely no substitute for human moderation. Like, that's just the way that it is right now. In addition to human moderation, and to speak to your point a little bit, is that platforms have to, and we sort of as like denizens of the general cultural internet have to trust communities to a certain extent to moderate themselves. So to sort of draw a bit of a contrast from Tumblr to a platform that's done this, I think, extremely well is an archive of our own, which is the fan fiction archive that sort of sprung up out of the great live journal purge about some years older. Some of you who remembers, yeah, there you go. Dark times, my friends.
It just won a Hugo, an archive of our own.
Yeah, and now, like, how far have we come, right? From like almost the brink of destruction to winning a Hugo. So for those who don't know, an archive of our own is a massive fan fiction community and archive that when LiveJournal banned, it wasn't so concerned with adult content at the time. It was more concerned with potential copyright or content that particularly possibly infringed on copyright, though of course adult content was kind of a problem too. And where Tumblr at least is just like making stuff go dark, LiveJournal was deleting things, like people's things that they'd worked on for years just vanished, and sort of out of that an archive of our own sort of sprung up as a like, we will never do this. We, the community, have decided that this can never happen again. How can we build our own platform? And one of the things that an archive of our own does really beautifully is that they trust their communities to moderate themselves. They understand that every fandom and every community that springs up around it is going to have different standards, different social norms, different sense of morals, a different sense of propriety, and whatever those sort of moderating process and whatever those standards are need to be decided in community with as little interference as possible. So of course there are like a few points of like, we absolutely cannot have this kind of content here under any circumstances, but they're as minimal as possible. And for the most part, those communities are sort of left to moderate themselves, and all of those communities are thriving because of it. So I don't know how that scales. I don't have a good answer for that, but that's human moderation. That's all we got.
I feel like an important difference is also whether or not a company is for profit. As a person who contributes to the internet and who contributes things that are more often than not deemed offensive, while I think that platforms have a responsibility, I do not trust them to have a responsibility if they are a for-profit entity, right? It's not, because I understand that the choice they're going to make at some point is a business choice, and business choices are always going to throw artists and marginalized people and under the bus, right? Because it's not, unless it's Pride and they think they can make a bunch of money off of us. But other than those exact moments, we are going to be the first to go. And the other thing that I kind of want to point out is that we've talked a little bit up to this point about what happened after they made the choice to get rid of porn, which they already stepped sideways into, right? When you think about the people who put things like child pornography on the internet, they don't care that they're not honoring your terms of service. Like, they are not reading your terms of service and then being like, oh yeah, this is the platform that will accept my shit, right? And so by changing your terms of service, you are not going to weed out the people on the internet that in the first place don't care about what your platform terms are, right? And so I feel like there's also for me, there's an important step between we chose to get rid of porn and how effective were the methods that we chose to do that, but also that choice in the first place was misguided, right? And for me, feels very clearly targeted.
I want to bring this a little bit back to Archive of Our Own because it's one of the best examples of everything here. But what's interesting about it is in the name archive. So in the early days of fandom communities, you had things like Usenet, you had things like LiveJournal, which were great communities for both posting works and for the social aspect of it. The thing about archive is it is really mostly an archive. That's doing the archival aspect of the work, whereas the social aspect of the work is it. Even now with archive, it's still happening on Tumblr, happening on Twitter, and so even though this archive is there and it's amazing, it's still not everything that the fandom needs. The fandom, even with this self-content moderated space, has to also deal with the social aspect of things as well. And when you start talking about content moderation in an archival space versus content moderation in the social space, you have to think about very different problems there. You have to think about chat. If you're having a voice chat with someone and that's how you're doing your social, I mention that because many of the conversations when Tumblr started to be a little difficult moved over to Discord, which has more voice chat. And how are you doing moderation in voice chat? Are you going to remove someone's post? No, it was a voice chat. And so you have this whole extra set of problems to deal with. And so as much as I love the archive, I don't think we could just look to that for all of our content moderation solutions, unfortunately. And we still need those good content moderation practices in the social space as well. It's not enough just to have good content moderation in one aspect of a community.
So do you think it's possible for a marginalized community to develop social, and scale it, right? Where you end up with a community of, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people without being completely beholden to the corporate overlord of some platform deciding, you know what, we're family friendly, we don't, this is too dangerous for us.
I mean, one of the ways that you can easily deal with that is by having better user controls around these things. Let people choose their own communities. If you look at surveys of what fandom actually wants, I warned you I'd be getting into the academia here. It's largely about having granular privacy controls. And once you're able to control your own community and choose your own content, for example, right? Like when you put on Google Safe Search, you can choose not to view certain images. And so having different abilities of people to choose who they talk to and having different moderation options for different internal communities is one of the things that can make that easier.
So I'm actually going to throw something in here that the answer is yes. I absolutely believe there is the ability to create platforms where you've got absolute control and the absolute ability without being beholden to the corporate overlords. However, here's what it's going to take. It's not going to be free to use. Those users have to be ready to at least help cover some of the expense of it or find advertisers to help cover that expense. But you're going to be there are definitely private networks that are out there that go and cover and create communities, and they grow, they're paid, and part of paying the price of admission is supporting it. So the answer is yes. It's just not going to necessarily be free to the user.
Right.
I've heard that sex toy makers can't advertise on Reddit anymore, so I feel like there's probably a whole network of people willing to pay for advertising. Just if somebody wants to go down that road.
Yeah.
I know they're having a really hard time figuring out how to market to people at the current moment.
Mm-hmm. A question and
There are a couple.
a couple questions then.
One of my first things that comes to mind. Well, first of all, there was no April Fool's thing this year, which is very telling. But one of the things that comes to mind about content curation was that, limiting was that at that time in December, I don't know if you remember, but we were plagued with Russian bots in the comments, making them almost unusable. I mean, like, it was outrageous how like it was making all the comment sections, like the notes, you couldn't even read it for all the Russian bots. So that was happening at the very moment when they said, "Oh, we're gonna start culling content," and it's like, really, bitches, because you're not doing anything about this, and it was so frustrating.
This flashy microphone is the best.
I have so much to say I don't even know where to start. So I'll try to narrow it down to 2 comments. And the first one is, I feel like whenever a site allows advertising and is free to use, there's a conflict of interest because you're not the customer, you're the product. They are selling you to the advertiser. So yes, I absolutely agree with Jim on that one. And the other one is I have a really stupid example of the AI takedown. I'll try to like make it short. So I had a cat who needed surgery. And so I did it on Tumblr, and I had gave the URL to some people who cared and the vet and stuff. Tumblr has identified 2 videos of a post-surgical cat with a cone on his head as porn, and has taken them down, and they are not visible to me anymore. They are only visible to people who are not logged in as me, and they have listed on there, this was taken down because it's porn. Like, really? Wow. Okay.
It's late night, but I'll still not crack the joke that comes to mind.
Okay, it took you a hot second.
Yeah, there's like a second and a half delay.
What joke could possibly be made about cats and porn?
Okay, I was actually like, is there some sort of porn subgenre I don't know where people wear cones?
There is now.
Rule 34. Rule 34. All right, so first off...
For surgery, so...
So first off, I'm 41 years old. I remember the great strike through of 2006 of LiveJournal because apparently a lot of people were freaking out over Harry Potter porn being drawn. So I remember that. One of the frustrating things I find about Tumblr is that compared to Twitter and Facebook, your timeline is chronologically, it still has that over the 2. So it makes it frustrating when you hear about all the people that they say are that older people are violating their TOS. Almost, you got TERFs, you got Nazis, you got other bigots on there that are still on there. Porn bots galore. So, in relating back to the AI, part of me feels that, and I see this with Facebook all the time, is that their AI is created and maintained by probably what is a bunch of straight white guys, I can only assume. As such, there's no nuance to it. It's like low effort, minimum effort. That way they don't have to spend all this money on it. Just put the little AI out there, okay, go on, get it. Oh, it was a cat video? Oh, no, it's fine. Go on.
So an interesting thing about Facebook and in particular, and their and AI moderation, is that Facebook actually uses a lot of human moderation, but in a really horrifying way. So a lot of Facebook's moderation is as much as sort of there's I can only assume some sort of hive mind that's out searching for female presenting nipples or whatever.
But if you replace them with the male nipples, it's perfectly fine.
Exactly.
Patriarchy.
Thank you. But they outsource a lot of that moderation to other countries. There are huge huge communities, or not communities, but workers in the Philippines in particular who sort of have to go through that content, huge moderation farms. In addition to the problem that you have where you have completely different cultural norms necessarily, or often clashing cultural norms from the communities that are moderating that content. The communities moderating the content are not at all connected to the content that they are in fact moderating. But you also have a ton of turnover and burnout because you're also asking humans to be exposed to often really horrific content in the process. So for every boob that should not be censored, you might also be wading through animal cruelty videos, right, and flagging things like that. So unfortunately, there when it comes to Facebook in particular, just to add a little bit more complication to that issue, they're trying to employ people to do this, but doing it very, very badly.
Right, and I just pause the questions there for 1 second because it touches on a couple of things I'd like the panelists to talk about. One is, given how much content has to go up to a site like Facebook or Tumblr, we're saying on one hand, these AI algorithms are terrible. But on the other hand, you do have, and there are documentaries coming out about it. All these armies of Facebook moderators who are getting PTSD from the content that's coming up that they have to sort through. And I think on some level we've outsourced our nightmares to these people. They have nightmares, so we don't have to. And I wonder whether it's possible to look at AI in this sense, AI content moderation, as a form of harm reduction. If this terrible content is going to come up and it's going to be bad for people who look at it, and we don't want AI, what do we do?
One thing I want to say is, if those are interested, there's an interesting documentary called "The Cleaners," which deals with the people who are primarily. It's about the Facebook reviewers, content reviewers, and it's very interesting to see just the toughness of that life. So I think there's still a value to human review. But it is very much in a value of like you escalate things to a human review when there's some doubt. So if you could have you have a number of things which you might already have hashes for have been pre-decided. Okay, that's pretty easy for a machine to figure out. Then there is new stuff, and I think for a lot of the Tumblr ones, or all of the egregious examples, certainly it would not take even the shortest look to realize that it's not porn. And if you go beyond that, there may be some gray areas, and we've certainly seen examples of where something was a little bit vague and it got caught, and then if you knew the context, I should actually mention that is one of the things that happens with the human reviewers is they get zero context, so they see the image, but not where the image and what context the image is being presented in, and sometimes that context is critical for understanding it, and they have time that they have to, so many per hour that they need to go through to maintain their job, and so this ends up with being seconds to make a determination, porn, not porn, violating the terms of service, not violating the terms of service. So there's not a lot of time to think about it, but there are many ones that if the companies did take the time to think about it, they would be able to have avoided a lot of problems before they took some valid content down.
Yeah, I think I agree that the answer is escalation, right? That as you can have the worst, broadest sieve kind of AI pulling through things, pulling out the most obvious, as long as there is a way for any person to say I think this is an error, and to escalate that and to have human review at that point.
Well, and I think there's one other part to this that goes back to the first question, which is responsibility. What is the responsibility of the platform? And I'm going to say something that's going to be kind of horrific because I've had to see it. So again, reviewers on a tendency, from what I understand, seem to burn out about every 90 days. They do have PTSD. There is significant trauma. So the question is the responsibility of the platform to protect its users from some of the most horrific things, be it an active shooter, be it child porn, be it any number of things. Is it better to traumatize the one person who's being paid for that to protect its users? And so the question is, how best can we use AI to get to that escalation point? And this is one of those nasty circles of chicken or the egg and who is responsible.
I also think we have to start looking at that kind of work as hazard pay level work. The same way that no regular human should have to run into a burning building, but there are humans who run into burning buildings, and hazard pay is a real thing, right?
And so is training.
And training, yeah, absolutely. A ton of training, a ton of therapy being available, right? Medical care, both in a physical sense and in a emotional and psychological sense. So to if you're having people succumbing to PTSD at this horrific rate, I think a lot of that can be mitigated by training those people appropriately, by providing resources to minimize the harm that's happening, and to compensate those people accordingly for the vital but potentially very harmful work that they're doing.
So I have a question for you on that.
Sure.
So if that was really the case, and my main concern is the health and welfare and benefit of people, why am I outsourcing it to the cheapest provider in the cheapest place I can go?
Exactly. You can't, like, no. Right? So obviously that practice does not work with this, right? Like it becomes like that kind of content moderation becomes suddenly a like highly skilled and highly trained and compensated accordingly kind of profession, which is not something, sort of a way that we currently look at that kind of work.
It's a specialist.
Absolutely, it is.
I mean, that makes me think of something that I haven't thought about before this exact moment. So, good warning, not
Go on.
fully formed thought. But if in that world, right, where we're going to have AI do most of our content moderation and then have people be able to appeal things, one of the elements that is necessary for transparency is the company's standpoint on a whole lot of political issues. And I don't see someone like Facebook drawing that line, right? So for me to say, this is art, this isn't porn, and Facebook to be like, fuck you, that's porn, go home, go back to Canada where fisting is legal or whatever. But like, this is like, and those lines need to be really transparent, right? Because this isn't a universal truth. There are things that I think everybody in this room can agree on, right? But that's also going to change from room to room. And so for there to be even a transparent escalation process, there has to be a really transparent statement about what each company thinks is across the line. And that's like a morality that I don't see these major companies ever putting into position.
But I would just to bring it sort of back to Tumblr for a second. Like, part of the problem though was that they weren't trying to put in a policy to ban things that were like extremely challenging and going to give people nightmares. I mean, the female presenting nipple, like it's not going to be that bad for them, and it's going to be like their definition of what was not acceptable was just a very puritanical standard, and it wasn't in keeping with the community is there. So yeah, there totally are some really tough stuff that gets posted on any kind of site, and some issues that are tough to deal with that. But Tumblr went and just broad brush said, like, get rid of it all, we don't care. And then when they got some pushback, they were like, well, we were wrong about these things and so on. But they still didn't provide very, very clear guidelines. And they were moving things that were probably not outside of the outside of the norm, not pushing at the edges of obscenity, not that were very acceptable within long-standing communities that were coming to that site, and I think that's what actually caused Tumblr to utterly fail.
But that's a political statement, right? Like that is a political statement saying we don't care about all of the gray area that gets washed away in this. As a person who on Tumblr both has female and male presenting nipples, depending on where in the timeline you go, right? Like what is that statement about what a person like my body is being said, right? Like I don't think that some of those photos got flagged and some of them didn't because Tumblr was respecting my gender identity. And it's always the same groups that get pushed aside in those decisions, right? And I think we like to often frame these choices as not active choices, and they are, right? That is a political statement, which is the thing that comes back to me a lot to do with corporations and nonprofits and that whole divide.
Which is, again, why I don't trust most organizations.
Yeah.
Right, totally.
Yeah.
I also think it puts, all of those platforms in the position where, like, you probably have to turn to the experts in order to make a lot of these calls, which means treating pornographers as experts, which like a lot of companies are super, super loath to do, but like, there are definitely things where two people are having a really awesome time and are super into it that look exactly like two people, or at least one person having a really terrible time and not being into it if you don't know the context to that image. Or like somebody who's completely unfamiliar with like a particular community might look at an image that is absolutely consensual and think that they're seeing something that's not. And in order to like view a lot of difficult images, or at least, at least images outside your own taste, I suppose, with any sort of objectivity, you really do have to appeal to experts.
Right, and this, for anyone who's here for the Sesta Fosta panel, it leads into the problem where, especially you see it with sex workers, but marginalized people in general, they are not considered experts on their own experience. If you're drafting a sex work law, the last person whose opinion you're going to respect is a sex worker, because they're obviously either, they don't know what they're doing, or they're, you talk to anyone else and listen to what they have to say. And I think Tumblr, their policies did not reflect their communities. Well, I know we had a couple more questions. I want to make sure we were able to get a few more.
Well, while we're doing that, let me throw one more thing in there, and this is also from a trafficking standpoint. How can you necessarily identify what's consensual? And this also goes along with trafficking. What we see coming out of Eastern Europe, a lot of things there too, is necessarily saying what is actually consensual.
Yeah, I wanted to comment that, Tumblr had a massive problem with white nationalist harassment. White nationalist harassment before all of this went down. I have a friend who's a Norse pantheon pagan, and they were posting stuff about how Norse pantheon is not white nationalist, and you're wrong if you're using it that way. And they were getting a lot of very disgusting hate from white nationalists because of it, kept reporting it to Tumblr, nothing was done. And the amount of furor over nipples as opposed to the actual harassment that was already taking place was like, who are you trying to satisfy here and why? And it was deeply infuriating, on top of a lot of problems that Tumblr had failed to resolve for years anyway. And that was, yeah. I also felt like I have been through several of the fandom transitions from different platforms. And there was something new on Tumblr, which was fandom as a single entity identifying itself as such, and things propagating across fandoms. I have never seen an Avengers movie. I know the plots of all of the Avengers movies purely through Tumblr memes.
Through GIF form.
Yeah.
Yes.
Spider-Man and Tony Stark.
Yeah.
We should not, but we do.
And all of the alternatives to Tumblr that I've seen suggested have not had that kind of interconnection, and I don't know that they have the capacity to develop it. And I feel like it's one of the things we have lost as a community in having to move off of Tumblr for very valid reasons.
I will say in response to your first point, both your points are totally valid, that the content moderation team at Tumblr internally thinks white nationalism is a huge problem that they're trying to get off their networks. But as mentioned, there are all kinds of bot problems, and this kind of directive was given to them around the same time, and I think that they were not able to effectively prioritize or figure out how to manage it. But unlike a lot of platforms like Twitter, Tumblr internally is working actually super hard to fight white nationalism. And one of the reasons that their timeline is chronological and not the type of timeline that Facebook and Twitter use is specifically because they've felt like those types of timelines allow for the amplification of content that is problematic through engagement. If you post inflammatory content, it gets more engagement and it rises up in the algorithm. And one of the reasons they haven't done that is they felt that was part why you saw so many problems on Facebook and Twitter.
I want to make a quick statement about the migration problem, which is like a serious thing. So if you look at the timeline of what happened with LiveJournal, right? LiveJournal's mandates that came down from above started happening in 2007. But the great migration off of LiveJournal happened, it didn't completely really happen until 2009. What happened in 2009? Well, between 2007 and 2009, members of fandom were dealing with all the garbage that is happening on Tumblr today. But Archive of Our Own didn't exist till 2009, so there was no place to go. So the thing you mentioned about having an alternative is, in fact, key for keeping together a cohesive fandom. And it's like, without having that alternative available, you just deal with the existing platform, or you fragment, and there's no other place to go.
You're the expert.
The first question, or that started this, right, was does a platform have responsibility to its user? And it feels like that's a question that only addresses half of the issue, right? Because, you know, we're talking about moderation and we're talking about controls and AI, but what we're also not talking about is that platform's partners, and specifically 8chan and Cloudflare, right? So, I mean, because you can enforce, you can hire 1,000 moderators, but if you cause bad PR for your partner's, you know, IPO, they're going to yank you off the internet. So, I mean, where do you balance that in this conversation?
Anyone have any thoughts on Cloudflare 8chan? I have a lot, but
I mean, I have several thoughts, few that can be repeated in public, but I feel like, so I'm actually gonna put Jairus on the spot, maybe a tiny bit here. Oh yeah, in that, because I've heard you speak about this pretty intelligently. But the problems that arise when an organization has responsibilities to, say, a board or to their shareholders, as opposed to their users or their platform or whatever. So maybe you can. I think you should field this one, honestly.
Sure. I mean, like I work for Mozilla, which is a nonprofit, and so we don't have to worry about shareholders, right? We are the sole shareholder, and the reason I work there, and the reason kind of my work has largely involved not-for-profit and public institutions, is because I really feel like as soon as it's capitalism at the bottom of the line, it's not just, oh, things are probably going to go bad. It's, oh, the board has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure the bottom line is what matters, and if they don't do it, they can go to jail. And that's probably the wrong thing we should be sending board members to jail for. And I think that with Cloudflare, I don't want to speculate on whether their upcoming IPO had something to do with it or not, but I think definitely the 3 live stream murders is probably not great PR. I think that companies that provide a service to anyone, no matter what, because they think, oh, free speech, have kind of relinquished their moral responsibility to the other communities they service and to the internet at large. And I think that people say all the time, the First Amendment is about what the government, it protects you from the government, not from, like a business, right? And there's no reason for companies like Cloudflare or anyone else to willingly do business with someone like 8chan. So I really do feel like the responsibility of companies is not just to their communities that are on their platform, but also to the larger internet community that they participate in. And I think that you can't have healthy communities with toxic elements that are working and are very creative to disrupt explicitly the most vulnerable parts of those communities.
And if I can throw in just a little bit more on top of that, this is one of those things where I frequently speak and write about the balance between privacy and security and free speech, because it's one of those things that gets down to trying to balance what the ethos is of the person or the government you're dealing with, because obviously we start talking about crossing borders and things like this, and what a particular group of users will find as acceptable or not. And I think this is one of the big challenges we have, is that most of these platforms, Tumblr and all these, and how they curate the communities and how people are let into them. And I think this is where we see things like the hate speech coming in against marginalized communities. I think because these platforms don't do 2 things. They don't give those communities enough tools to really curate properly and manage them properly and secure them properly, and to then say, what are our rules within our community on your platform, as long as we play by the rules.
Right. Honestly, the best moderated community I've ever been part of was a message board called Something Awful, which actually it was, and it is if you kind of know your terrible internet history, it's kind of responsible in a way for 4chan. but it cost $5 to join, or $10 to join. If you broke the rules, you got banned. It cost another $10 to join. The rules were basically don't be a jerk, but the number one rule is a moderator can ban you for any reason at any time. You can't rules lawyer. And if you sass a moderator, that's a bannable offense. So it really weeded out trolls because trolls didn't want to spend money to keep trolling. They would rather go somewhere else. And it's just a small enough amount that it's not really a barrier to entry. And when they started doing advertising on their site, because it was very expensive to run, they only accepted ads from community members. So anyone could buy a banner ad on Something Awful who was a member and had been a member for a long time for like $20 or whatever. But they worked really, really hard to curate moderators that understood their individual communities and worked really hard to make sure that when they started commercializing it, they were doing it from their community to serve their community.
So that actually gets to the thing that I wanted to ask, which is that there was a question earlier about whether the Archive of Our Own model of, a self-funded and self-moderated community would be replicable in other cases for the social functions of fandom and for other communities. And it just sort of occurred to me while that was going on that existed, before social media, before 1.0, and even coexisting with it for a long time. It was forum culture, it was message boards. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts are on sort of the decay of forums, what's responsible for it, and whether, what the barriers would be to some sort of revival and the modernization of that.
Erica?
I'm just speaking from personal experience here. I've used forums, and I've used Tumblr, and one of these is much nicer and easier to use in terms of seeing the content I want to find, being able to finding new content and finding existing content from the people and topics that I care about. There's a lot of engineering and design that went into this. User experience design is an entire field, and modern user experience has really improved. So I think that there's been technological developments in the user experience space, and those have been largely done in companies that have been a part of this larger social movement. And that's, this one I don't have the data facts for, I don't have the academic study on this one, but I might know someone who does, and maybe I'll get back to you. But anyway, I suspect that a lot of it is because of the UI improvements, and that were something to be made that takes into account all the modern features that we expect a modern social network to have. It wouldn't necessarily have that same decay as message boards did.
Having done BBSs back in the early 80s, because I'm old, I got some of my earliest writing done as a kid on the BBSs on a 1200 baud modem where you just sort of sit and wait because you just type something smart-ass back. But in those communities back in those days, if somebody was being an ass, they got a boot really quick. It was slow. It was, you had to wait for responses. The flame wars could be extraordinarily fun. Wait, I didn't say that out loud, did I? But if we look now at the tools and the platforms that are available, if you're willing to put in the work and you're willing to grow the communities, the tools exist now. And I'm going to tell you right now, I've built them before. If you go out there and you use membership community tools and you find platforms that are going to accept your content, you treat it like a little business. You use enough money coming through the door to help fund the platform. Depending on what your content is, you might have to get a little bit creative about who is hosting your database and who's hosting your front end and getting the speed and the rest of that. But absolutely. And I think that this is one of the places that we're going, is that marginalized communities are finally going to go look at these quote-unquote free platforms, and I hate using that term because there's not a damn thing free about any of them. Not a thing. I think that communities that are feeling abused, marginalized, and having people come after them are going to go off and form their own little worlds, their own little communities. It's going to take time to build, and it's going to be like anything else. Word of mouth, there's going to be some cost to entry, some cost to play, and you're going to have the security for it.
I think we have time for one more question, so I want to make sure that our panelists have a chance to say anything burning.
No, I was just going to add on to that. People who aren't marginalized should for sure use their positions of power to demand better of the communities that already exist. I am here for community and grassroots building, especially on the internet. It's not a skill set that I super have, but like I've had many conversations with friends about what that utopia looks like online. But I also think that a huge part of this conversation is that if you aren't a person who is experiencing this kind of harassment and this kind of negativity on the internet, you are the person who needs to be calling these companies and making these, like, holding these companies accountable. As a user, you have more emotional energy to put into that fight than we do, right? And so if that is your experience on the internet, that is a thing that I think would be super useful for people who don't necessarily live this while we're building our other online communities.
I can't snap my fingers, but I would if I could. I don't know how. I can't snap.
So these communities do cost money to run. They cost money to run these websites, and there's a lot of bandwidth and processing involved. And payments and money processing is part of the equation. Visa, MasterCard, these companies have put their thumb on the scale for certain kinds of content. Also Patreon and their issues with PayPal and maybe some censorship in that community recently. It seems like these companies it needs to be an alternative. I don't know if there's been any progress on that front. Is there another PayPal coming, or is the community working on something like that that would be an alternative?
The short answer is Sesta Fosta makes that difficult to impossible.
Okay.
Like it, we can talk about it more, but the shorter answer is because of Sesta Fosta, the liability for companies, payment processors, is so huge that it's nearly impossible for that to kind of happen soon. Does anyone want to say anything? They didn't have a chance to say.
I all right. So for full disclosure, I do a lot of work in fintech. There's a reason I wasn't on the Sesta Fosta panel this year. My wife was last year, because I can't necessarily get into and talk about some of that because I deal with it frequently and I'm from the other side. But it's like anything else. If you want to do it, there are always going to be ways. The thing is this: it's about the risk. It's how do you do the middleman. The reason we have seen the explosion in cryptocurrencies is because much of it, other than the speculative period, was money laundering, trafficking, illicit activity. However, you create middle currencies like that, there's always a way, but there's always a risk. And so whoever is standing up these platforms is going to have to accept a certain degree of risk and still be back to responsible for curating the content, curating the people, none of which is cheap. So I think, again, leans back towards these communities are going to be smaller, they're going to be diverse, they're going to be very niche, because that's the way to minimize the risk and minimize the costs.
There's like so many hands, and I'm so curious what people have to say, but I know that we're...
There are a lot of hands, and please come bug us.
We're the last one of the night.
The last one of the night. Amazing. 10 more minutes.
Thanks, God.
Thank you. Okay. Before we go 10 more minutes, I would like everyone to reach into their pockets and take out their phone right now. I'm watching. Take out your phone.
I'm wearing women's pants. I don't have pockets.
Yeah. Okay. Open the Dragon Con app. And rate this session for this man's beautiful extension, so we can all answer your questions.
And so we stay in a big room next year.
Yeah.
And I get to use the word fisting in public again.
Recorded for posterity.
Yes.
Hi. So I'm one of the straight white allies who works in machine learning.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if y'all know of any open source, community-driven, machine learning-based auto moderation systems out there that I could contribute to.
I wish I did. I wish I knew exactly where to point you, but I don't. And the answer might be you have to do it, friend.
Cool. What do you want to see?
So
Come talk to me later. So literally, a other human may speak tonight, but...
So there is a Mozilla fellow named Caroline Sinders whose work is on content moderation and figuring out how much of it you can automate or not. I would recommend connecting with her because she's doing a lot of super interesting work on the topic.
Strong second. She's fantastic.
The bunny in the back.
I'm a cat person.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to misspecies you.
It's okay.
It happens. We're talking about ads and banners and Tumblr and various websites. You cannot go to any kind of website without having a banner. And that is the truth. But here's what is disturbing for me. Everybody in this room has a cell phone, damn near. I was at work. This is after the shooting in Dayton. My coworker used to work for a firearms company. He was selling them to a local gun shop. And I was talking to him about various firearms. I had my phone just sitting on the desk.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there. Because, you're not going to believe me, but your phone is not listening to you. It's worse than that. It is worse. It would be easier if your phone was listening to you. But what's actually happening is the profile advertisers have of you and of your friends and of the things that you talk about and your likely reactions to what's happening in the news is so good that you're getting ads based on that. It's worse. You could just put, like you could play a white noise machine if it actually was listening to you, but it's not. There's been tons of tests and audits. Any time that's been discovered, it's been like an accident or a bug and was quickly kind of closed. It's worse. It's that we live in surveillance capitalism where the business model of all of these companies is collect as much information to get you to buy stuff, and that's how good they are at it right now.
All I know is I was going to various websites when I got home. I was getting banners for firearms. I was getting banners for the NRA. I was getting pop-up ads for the Georgia gun show.
Gun sales go up after every mass shooting.
I know, it's crazy, and there were 2 more in Texas today.
I'm going to admit to a terrible thing, okay? And you all have to promise not to tar and feather me after this, but part of my day job is being one of those targeted ad people. Now, I swear to you, I use this for the powers of good. I use it to show people the science fiction television shows they would probably like to watch. Mm-hmm. That is how I use my terrible skills. It mostly for good. Sometimes also video games. But the amount, as an advertiser, the amount of data that is available to me is extraordinary and horrifying, like to a truly spectacular degree. It's made me pretty paranoid as a result. So just to sort of like lend credence to that, when we talk about in advertising, we talk about how to close the loop, which is how to track every moment from the time a person sees an ad for the first time until the moment they make the purchase. And this involves everything from not just like, I clicked this ad, I went to the website, I bought it or not. It's like, did I then go to a brick and mortar store and make a purchase 2 days later? Which I can pretty easily find out via some, not me personally, but like it's trackable via GPS, for example. So you can, sort of like as we become tracked, like literally every second of our lives more and more, it becomes easier for advertisers to close that loop, meaning we can kind of figure out like exactly what your behavior is probably going to be at any moment in time. So I'm sorry.
And this is why you should support organizations like the EFF and Mozilla.
So, and I actually wanted to just make a plug here for an open source free browser extension called Privacy Badger that blocks trackers, and it uses its own algorithm to try and figure out if something is behaving like a tracker, so that way it can try and block new trackers even before they are otherwise identified. So get it, put it on your browser, and have a few less trackers after you.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to challenge is just to make everybody paranoid. Go out there and go create yourself a Google AdWords account. Go create yourself a Facebook Ads account. And just go look at the amount of data and how quickly you can filter down communities.
It's actually a good idea.
That's actually a great idea. It's free. Like you can just make the account.
Yeah. Part of me wants to talk about what you guys just talked about. I do data visualization. I actually do data ethics here in town. So I want to touch on two questions. They're completely separate. The first one's more scary. There is a way to, based on the human trafficking model, and then it was used to basically eliminate trolls in one sector in China. They built a model that's so evil, it's worse than security, like watching you all the time. It's worse than pretty much anything you can possibly think of what we're talking about right now. The only reason that it hasn't been used is the people who made it don't release it to the public. It's only in this research incubation. So the question is, what if the new automated system is worse than the problem? What do you do? And then my second question, which is kind of more going toward your scaling up question, well, I would say that would be possible, but is the actual complaint reports that say that EFF is getting, are those actually public and transparent so that somebody could then build a model to predict the people who are getting hit with false positives?
I'm going to give you one of those two questions. Which one do you want to answer, first or second?
The second one's more important because that's how we solve things.
I can answer the first one in a word.
So on the transparency, there is far too little transparency from the major companies about their takedown processes. I mean, in some cases, they have transparency over certain areas. So, like, only in the last year, Facebook put out some transparency about their takedowns in certain areas, but not the complete areas that they will take something down for. Other companies have no transparency whatsoever. And then in terms of like the false positives, where we need to get transparency not only on what the takedowns are, but the transparency on the appeals process. How many times does an appeal, succeed or fail? And the companies are not yet providing that. We're pressuring them on this. We did a project this year called the Who Has Your Back report. It's the online censorship edition. So rating the companies on how well they were doing there. But on appeals transparency, it was abysmal. The upside, the good news, was that many of the companies, the vast majority, agreed that the Santa Clara principles, which do talk about appeals and transparency, were a good basis for having the conversation, which is sort of moving the companies along. And so we're hoping to continue the dialogue and get them to a better spot, but we are far away from getting the data necessary to sort of figure that out.
Okay, let's talk later. I have a story that might help you.
So you were talking about us using our voice to help support marginalized communities. A lot of times these are not mainstream, so what's the best way to keep an eye on that before it's just a footnote in the New York Times?
By these, what do you mean?
These communities that are sometimes marginalized before it's a done deal, when our voices are needed the most.
I think it's pretty accessible. I think that there are a lot of conversations. Like, I would challenge the idea that it's not super mainstream. Like, I think it's pretty easy to go on Twitter and find a good chunk of, like, really smart, really on the ball, like, queer and trans folk or sex workers or people of color that are making really articulate and really accessible arguments around and conversations around what people can do, but also that it only takes finding a few of those people, because most of the people that do it really well are constantly amplifying other people before you have a whole lot of folks that you can get in. Like, that one of the recommendations last night was just get involved in the conversation. Like, go pay attention to the conversations that are already happening all over the place. Last night it was a conversation about how quickly things like Sesta Fosta went through sex work Twitter, and as a person who is sex work Twitter adjacent, like, it happened real fast. Like, I remember conversations about Sesta Fosta happening long before anybody in policy was having those conversations already existing on Twitter, right? Like, I think there is an argument to be made that a few keyword searches could probably get you to a good amount of places on the internet where people are saying really intelligent things.
I would just add to that whatever it is you're interested in and passionate about, there are queer and trans and people of color who are at least as good and at least as passionate and like certainly have super smart and interesting things to say. So like make an effort to reach out beyond your sort of immediate social circle and immediate sort of sphere of influence. Follow those people for the interests you have in common with them, and I will guarantee you they will start saying things about the issues that impact them and their lives, and that will absolutely like lead you to ways to get involved.
So even if what you're into is D&D, find a dozen black people who play D&D and follow them.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%.
There are a lot of really rad humans who play D&D and are having really great political conversations while nerding out about D&D.
100%.
Feel free to give the short and sweet answer to this question, but practically from the Tumblr perspective, do you guys use Kubeflow or HDFS, Spark implementation to do all your machine learning?
None of us work for Tumblr.
No, sadly, none of us are Tumblr folk.
Thanks, guys.
I think Tumblr uses. Oh God, I just forgot the name of it.
Describe it.
I don't remember.
I invited somebody from Tumblr and it got me to find management.
Wow, that's a shame.
Wow.
That's a shame. Okay, we are at time. Thank you so much. All the questions, comments were amazing. If you didn't rate this panel, the guilt of how late you got to stay will haunt you. And you don't want that. Thank you, and thank you all of our panelists. They were all amazing and smart.
Thank you.